"Excuse me, ma'am. This section is for first class. Your seat is in the back." The flight attendant's smile was polished, her gesture toward economy deliberate. The white passenger beside her nodded in agreement. Cynthia looked up from her laptop, where schematics of the very aircraft cabin they sat in were displayed. Her single phone call didn't just summon the airline's CEO, it grounded the entire crew and triggered a federal audit. That woman was Dr. Cynthia Addisa, lead aerospace engineer for the very jet they were flying on. Her quiet response to the discrimination wasn't just personal, it exposed a systemic pattern airlines try to hide. What followed was a corporate earthquake, a federal investigation, and a shocking revelation about who really holds power at 35,000 feet. Because when they told her to go to the back, they had no idea she built the front. Cynthia Addisa didn't just earn her seat, she engineered it. For over a decade, she had navigated conference rooms where she was often the only black woman, solving problems of aerodynamics and structural integrity for one of the world's largest aircraft manufacturers. Her team's work on the composite wing design for the new twin-aisle jet was what made the first-class cabin so quiet, so smooth. She was flying from Seattle to Atlanta for a critical safety review, her laptop filled with the proprietary schematics that were the blueprint of the aircraft around her. The confrontation began 30 minutes after takeoff. Cynthia had just opened her laptop when the passenger in 2A, a man in his 50s wearing a luxury watch, leaned over to the flight attendant, Gina. His whisper was just loud enough to be heard. "Is she supposed to be up here? She was in the boarding line with everyone else." Gina, a flight attendant with 15 years of experience, initially smiled politely. But then she looked at Cynthia, at her natural hair in a sleek bun, her minimalist black turtleneck, and the assumption clicked into place. It was a pattern documented in dozens of complaints. The presumption that a black woman in premium seating must be there by mistake. Gina approached her practiced hospitality mask firmly in place. "Ma'am, may I verify your boarding pass? We just want to make sure everyone is in their correct seat." Cynthia, familiar with this subtle dance, handed over her first-class ticket without a word. Gina scanned it, her smile tightening. The ticket was valid, but the passenger in 2A wasn't satisfied. "I'm just saying it's disruptive. Some of us paid a premium for a certain environment." That's when Gina made her decision. Instead of defending her paying customer, she chose to manage the discomfort of another. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice now carrying a brittle edge. "This section is for first class. Your seat is in the back." The cabin fell into a watchful silence. Other passengers looked up from their tablets and drinks. Cynthia closed her laptop slowly. "My seat is 3C, she stated, her voice calm, icy, "as my ticket shows." Gina's hand gestured firmly toward the curtain separating the cabins. "There seems to be a system error. We need to sort this out. Please gather your things." It was no longer a request. It was an order, a public performance of authority meant to placate the complaining passenger. In that moment, Cynthia wasn't a passenger. She was a problem to be relocated. What Gina and the man in 2A didn't see was the schematic on Cynthia's screen, a cross-section of the aircraft's fuselage, her employee ID badge partially visible in her bag's side pocket. They saw only what their bias allowed, an anomaly. Cynthia knew the statistics. Only 6.8% of aerospace engineers were black. To them, the odds were better that she was in the wrong seat than that she held the plans to the plane. But Cynthia had reached her endpoint. This wasn't her first encounter with flying while black, but it was to be her last on this airline. Instead of arguing, she picked up her phone. She didn't call customer service. She dialed a direct, private number. In the airline's corporate headquarters, the cell phone of the chief executive officer, Robert Sterling, buzzed on his desk. He answered, expecting a board member. He heard the calm, precise voice of his lead engineer on the $40 million project his company depended on. "Robert, it's Cynthia Addisa. I'm on flight 412. Your flight attendant is attempting to remove me from my first-class seat, claiming I don't belong here. I am informing you that if I am forced to move, My firm's safety certification review scheduled for tomorrow is canceled. Furthermore, I will be filing a formal discrimination complaint with the Department of Transportation the moment we land." Sterling's blood ran cold. The certification review was critical, delays would cost millions. But more than that, he knew Cynthia. She was meticulous, unflappable, and her reputation was stainless. If she said this was happening, it was happening. He asked for the flight attendant's name. Gina, thinking she was managing a difficult situation, returned to the galley only to have the onboard satellite phone ring. It was the senior vice president of in-flight operations. His first question was, "What in God's name are you doing?" The message from the cockpit was immediate and unambiguous. The captain emerged, his face stern. He quietly instructed Gina to return to her jump seat and not to interact with any passengers for the remainder of the flight. A wave of confused murmurs spread through first class. The passenger in 2A suddenly became very interested in his magazine, but the real shock came after landing. As the plane parked at the gate, an announcement crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, the entire crew of this flight is hereby relieved of duty pending an immediate investigation. Please deplane and accept our deepest apologies." On the jet bridge, Cynthia was met not by airline staff, but by two corporate security officers and a grim-looking woman from legal. They escorted her past gawking passengers, not to baggage claim but to a private conference room in the terminal. Robert Sterling was on a video screen, his face ashen. "Cynthia, we are launching a full audit. This is unacceptable." But Cynthia had already forwarded her recorded audio of the interaction to her personal lawyer. The incident was no longer an airline matter. It was a legal one, and the ground crew, now swarming the parked jet, had just received their most unusual order of the day: preserve the onboard data. Every word, every action from the moment the doors closed was now evidence. Yet within the airline's headquarters, a different strategy was already being formulated. The head of public relations drafted a statement framing the event as a regrettable misunderstanding. Legal began reviewing Cynthia's travel history, looking for any technicality. The goal was containment. They had survived discrimination complaints before. They assumed this would be no different. But they failed to account for one thing. Cynthia Addisa wasn't just a passenger. She was an architect. And she had built her entire career anticipating points of failure. She had just identified a critical one in their system, and she was prepared to ground them all. The airline's internal investigation began not with an apology but with a search for loopholes. In a sealed conference room 12 hours after the incident, the airline's crisis team pored over Cynthia's travel history. Their goal was not to understand the failure but to limit liability. The head of legal, a man named David Chen, pointed to a clause in the contract of carriage. Section 9, Paragraph C. The carrier reserves the right to reassign seats for operational reasons. He argued that if they could frame the attendant's error as an operational decision, not a discriminatory one, they could mitigate damages. But the head of corporate security, a former federal investigator named Lena Wright, pushed back. "You're missing the point. The attendant didn't cite operations. She told a paying customer she didn't belong. We have 42 witnesses and the cockpit voice recorder. This is a bias incident, plain and simple." Meanwhile, in her hotel room, Cynthia was not waiting for their verdict. She had already scheduled a conference call with her firm's legal counsel and a civil rights attorney named Marcus Thorne, a man who had taken on 2 major airlines and won. Thorne listened to the audio recording, his silence more telling than any outrage. When Cynthia finished, he said, "They're going to offer you a settlement. A year's worth of first-class travel, a donation to a charity of your choice, and a non-disclosure agreement so thick it would take a team of lawyers a week to read. Do not take it." His strategy was different. He filed a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation's Office of Aviation Consumer Protection that same afternoon, triggering a mandatory federal review. But he also did something else. He filed a parallel complaint with the Federal Aviation Administration, arguing that targeted harassment of a key safety engineer during a critical review phase could constitute an interference with aviation safety. This moved the case from a customer service complaint to a potential federal violation. Back at airline headquarters, the Human Resources Department interviewed Gina, the flight attendant. Gina, now terrified for her career, stuck to her script. "I was following protocol. I was addressing a seating discrepancy for the comfort of all passengers." But when presented with the audio, where the complaining passenger's words about a certain environment were clearly heard, her story began to crack. She admitted she felt pressure from the passenger, a frequent flyer who spent over $100,000 a year with the airline. The pressure to accommodate high-value customers, she said, was an unspoken rule. This admission was a detonator. It shifted the blame from one rogue attendant to a systemic practice of prioritizing wealthy, often white, passengers over others. The story, however, was no longer contained within corporate walls. An anonymous tip from someone within the airline's operations center was sent to a journalist at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The tip included only the flight number, the time, and 3 words: racial profiling first class. The journalist, Maya Rodriguez, had covered airline industry scandals for a decade. She made 2 calls, one to the Department of Transportation to confirm an active investigation, and one to Cynthia's engineering firm. The firm's public relations director, caught off guard, confirmed Cynthia Addisa was a lead engineer and was traveling on company business. That was all Maya needed. Her article went live at 6 a.m. the next morning. The headline was brutal: "Aerospace engineer who designed jet questioned over right to sit in first class." Social media ignited. The phrase "flying while black" began trending nationally by 9. Passengers started sharing their own stories under the hashtag, a torrent of similar humiliations: being asked for extra ID, being offered a crew meal instead of first-class dining, being mistaken for cabin crew. The airline's stock price dipped 2% in pre-market trading. The board of directors, who had been kept in the dark, demanded an emergency briefing. In that briefing, CEO Robert Sterling attempted to control the narrative. He presented the offered settlement to Cynthia and the internal review. A board member, an older woman named Alina Vance, interrupted him. "Robert, did the engineer in question design the wing on the new twin-aisle we have on order?" Sterling hesitated, then nodded. Vance leaned back in her chair. "So we harassed the person responsible for the structural integrity of a $400 million aircraft asset over a seat that cost us maybe $2,000 in revenue. Do I have that correct?" The room went silent. The financial calculus of the blunder was now devastatingly clear. It wasn't just a public relations problem. It was a catastrophic failure of risk management that threatened a vital supplier relationship. Under this pressure, Sterling was forced to make a public statement. He stood before cameras, his expression somber. "We are deeply sorry for the distress caused to Dr. Addisa. We have grounded the crew involved and are conducting a thorough audit of our procedures." He called it an isolated breakdown in protocol. But even as he spoke, his lawyers were served with Marcus Thorne's federal complaints. And Cynthia, watching the press conference from her hotel, issued a 1-sentence response through her attorney. "An isolated incident does not require a federal audit. A pattern does." This prompted the DOT to broaden its inquiry. They issued a subpoena for the airline's passenger complaint database for the past 5 years, specifically filtered by keywords like seat reassignment, race, and first class. What they found was a buried archive of shame. Over 200 similar complaints, nearly all from black or brown passengers, almost uniformly dismissed with form letters and minimal compensation. The data revealed a hidden algorithm. Complaints from passengers in premium cabins who were members of minority groups were 70% more likely to be labeled unsubstantiated and closed without interview than identical complaints from white passengers. Simultaneously, the internal audit turned its attention to Gina's personnel file. Buried in her training records was a revealing notation from a supervisor 8 years prior. After Gina had asked for a passenger to be moved from first class for excessive perfume, a note from the supervisor read, "Attendant shows excellent initiative in maintaining cabin ambience for our top-tier customers." The subjective concept of ambience was being used as a corporate-sanctioned tool for discrimination. The dominoes continued to fall. The passenger in 2A was identified as Richard Pell, a partner at a private equity firm. When contacted by reporters, he initially denied any wrongdoing, claiming he was merely asking a question. But then a former colleague came forward to a business journal, stating Pell had bragged about getting a downgraded passenger moved on a conference call. The story was no longer about one flight. It was about a culture of entitlement and a system built to serve it. Cynthia, however, was focused on a different file. With the help of Marcus Thorne, she filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the FAA for all incident reports involving interference with safety-critical personnel. The results were shocking. Over a dozen reports from pilots, air traffic controllers, and yes, engineers, who reported being harassed or challenged in ways that distracted them from safety-sensitive duties. The connection Thorne had theorized was real. Discrimination wasn't just a civil rights issue in the skis. It was a latent safety risk. The airline, now in full damage control mode, made a desperate play. They offered to settle with Cynthia for a sum rumored to be in the high six figures, along with a public seat on their new Diversity Advisory Council. Marcus Thorne presented the offer to Cynthia in his office. He laid out the choice: take the money and a platform to create change from within, or reject it and proceed with the federal case, a grueling public fight that could take years. Cynthia looked at the offer, then at the framed photo on Thorne's wall of Thurgood Marshall. She didn't hesitate. They created this system. They don't get to control the dismantling of it. We go to the hearing. The Department of Transportation scheduled a public enforcement hearing for 3 weeks' time. It would be a rare, transparent examination of airline discrimination practices. The airline assembled a powerhouse legal team. Cynthia and Thorne prepared their evidence. But 2 days before the hearing, Lena Wright, the airline's head of security, requested a private meeting with Cynthia and Thorne. She arrived without company lawyers. Her face was grave. "The internal audit found something else," she said, placing an encrypted drive on the table. "It's not just about passengers, it's about our own employees. And the man who started this, Richard Pell, he isn't just a frequent flyer. He's a major shareholder, and he's done this before." She took a deep breath. "The story you're about to tell at that hearing is only the first chapter. The real system is much, much darker." The encrypted drive contained not just data, but a map of institutional silence. Lena Wright explained, her voice low. For 3 years, a small team in corporate security had been flagging complaints that followed a specific pattern: high-value shareholders or their associates making subjective comfort complaints about minority passengers or junior employees in premium spaces. These complaints were automatically fast-tracked and almost always resolved in the complainant's favor. The system had a name internally: the Priority Passenger Protocol. Richard Pell was listed in the protocol's logs 17 times over 5 years. Each entry was a story. He had once gotten a young black financial analyst moved from a first-class seat on a red-eye, claiming her laptop light was too bright. He had complained about a Latino flight attendant's accent being too difficult to understand, resulting in the attendant being pulled from international routes. Pell wasn't just a passenger. He was a power user of a hidden privilege system. Marcus Thorne downloaded the data. His team began cross-referencing the complaint IDs with employee records. What they found was a hemorrhage of talent. At least 9 highly rated employees, flight attendants, pilots in training, and even a marketing executive had left the company or accepted demotions after being subject to these protocol complaints. The discrimination wasn't a bug in the system. It was a curated feature for a select group. And the protocol was funded, the documents suggested, through a discretionary budget managed by the Office of the Chief Commercial Officer, a man named Ian Frost. Confronted with this, the airline's legal team shifted from defense to damage limitation. They offered Lena Wright a substantial promotion and a transfer to a silent subsidiary to recant her statement. She refused, submitting her resignation instead. Her public statement was a single sentence: "I was hired to protect safety, not to protect prejudice." Her departure triggered a quiet exodus. 3 more mid-level managers in compliance and customer relations resigned within 48 hours, sending ripples of panic through the executive floor. The story now had a second source, and the media pounced. Maya Rodriguez's follow-up article connected the dots. Airline maintained secret protocol to accommodate wealthy shareholders' bias, documents show. This wasn't just about Cynthia anymore. It was about a shadow governance system where shareholding percentage could buy prejudicial preference. The Department of Transportation, now facing a potential scandal of regulatory failure, expanded its investigation into a full-blown systemic review of the entire airline's operating certificate. Within the company, a civil war erupted. The board split into 2 factions. One, led by Alina Vance, demanded immediate transparency and the firing of Chief Commercial Officer Ian Frost. The other, old guard members with ties to major shareholders like Pell, argued for containing the legal overreach and fighting the dot. CEO Robert Sterling, his authority crumbling, was paralyzed. In the midst of this, Cynthia's engineering firm made a decisive move. They formally suspended all safety consultation work with the airline, citing an environment incompatible with the focused, unbiased rigor required for aviation safety. The financial markets reacted instantly. The airline's stock plummeted 7% in a single day, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value. The cost of discrimination was now quantified in real time. Richard Pell, sensing the turning tide, gave an interview to a financial network. He appeared calm, avuncular. "This is a tragic case of a well-intentioned employee making a mistake, being twisted into a corporate conspiracy," he said. "I have always been a passionate supporter of the airline. My questions are always about service excellence, nothing more." He positioned himself as a concerned investor, a victim of a witch hunt, but Marcus Thorne had anticipated this. As Pell spoke, Thorne's team filed a civil racketeering suit against Pell, his private equity firm, and named executives at the airline. The suit alleged they had conspired to create a hostile public accommodation environment, manipulating corporate policy for personal comfort and financial gain, thereby damaging the company's value for other shareholders. It was a nuclear legal option. The filing unlocked a new phase: discovery. Thorne now had the right to subpoena Pell's emails, his firm's investment reports, and the airline's board minutes. What emerged was colder and more calculated than bias. Emails showed Pell's firm pushing the airline to maximize revenue per premium square foot by focusing on demographics with the highest lifetime loyalty spend. Internal analyses crudely correlated those demographics with race and age. The priority passenger protocol was, in part, a twisted customer retention tool for a tiny, ultra-wealthy segment. The discrimination was not just social, it was a perverse business strategy. Meanwhile, Cynthia used her platform not for vengeance but for testimony. She agreed to speak with the DOT investigators alone for 8 hours. She didn't just recount her story. She explained, as an engineer, how systemic instability works. "You don't look for the one cracked rivet," she told them. "You look for the pattern of stress that caused it. The pressure on that flight attendant came from a system designed to flex under the weight of money, not morality. That is a design flaw. And in aviation, we ground fleets for less." Her testimony reframed the entire issue from one of personal offense to one of systemic risk. As the public hearing date arrived, the airline made one last desperate move. They announced the immediate termination of Ian Frost, the chief commercial officer, and the dissolution of the priority passenger protocol. They positioned it as housecleaning, a renewal. They hoped to enter the hearing as a reformed entity, but it was too late. The night before the hearing, a package arrived at Marcus Thorne's office from an anonymous sender within the airline's finance department. It contained draft budgets from the previous 5 years. One line item, previously obscured, was highlighted: protocol exception compensation. It was a multi-million-dollar fund not for victims, but for paying off the employees who had been wrongfully disciplined or transferred under the protocol, binding them to strict NDAs. The airline hadn't just allowed discrimination, it had financially budgeted for the silence it required. The stage was now set for a confrontation not of facts, but of futures. The airline would argue it had excised a tumor. Cynthia and Thorne would prove the cancer was in the bloodstream. And waiting in the wings, the Department of Transportation held a power rarely invoked: the authority to condition the airline's right to fly on a complete, supervised restructuring of its corporate governance. The hearing would not be a trial. It would be a referendum on whether some passengers, by virtue of wealth and stock, could buy the sky while pushing others to the back. As Cynthia walked into the federal building that morning, she wasn't carrying a complaint. She was carrying a blueprint for tearing the entire system down to its foundations and building something that could truly fly. The federal hearing room was not a courtroom, but it held the same gravity. On one side sat the airline's new legal team, flanked by a chastened CEO, Robert Sterling, and an empty chair where the fired commercial officer would have been. On the other sat Cynthia Addisa, Marcus Thorne, and a stack of evidence that seemed to breathe with its own tension. The Department of Transportation presiding officer opened with a warning. This was not an adversarial proceeding, but an investigative one. Its goal was to determine if the airline's operating certificate, its literal license to fly, was compatible with federal anti-discrimination law. The airline's lead counsel began with contrition. He outlined the termination of the protocol, the firing of executives, and new mandatory bias training. He presented it as a story of redemption, a corporation healing itself. Then Marcus Thorne stood. He did not address the panel first. He turned to a screen and played the original audio from the flight. The crisp, cold exchange filled the room. "Your seat is in the back." Then he played another recording from the airline's own internal interview with Gina, the flight attendant. Her voice cracked as she said, "The pressure to accommodate high-value customers is an unspoken rule." Thorne let the silence hang. Then he said, "You cannot train away a rule you refuse to admit exists." He then presented the evidence from Lena Wright's drive, the priority passenger protocol logs. One by one, he read the entries, each a miniature story of humiliation. He connected them to the employee turnover data, showing the human cost. Then he unveiled the final piece, the budget line for protocol exception compensation. He projected the document on the screen. "This is not a mistake," Thorne said. "This is an accounting code." For 5 years, this airline financially budgeted for the consequences of its discrimination, allocating millions to buy the silence of the people it wronged. That is not a protocol. That is a conspiracy. The airline's lawyers objected, but the damage was done. The presiding officer, a veteran regulator with 30 years of experience, leaned forward, her eyes on Sterling. "Mr. Sterling, can you explain this line item?" Sterling, unprepared for this level of financial detail, faltered. He claimed ignorance. It was the worst possible answer. It implied either incompetence at the highest level or deceit. Cynthia was called to testify. She spoke not as a victim, but as an expert witness on systemic failure. She described how, in engineering, a single point of failure is traced back to its root cause. "The root cause here," she stated calmly, "is a corporate culture that assigned a higher value to shareholder comfort than to passenger dignity or employee justice. You cannot fix that with a training module. You must redesign the entire structure." She proposed a radical solution: the appointment of an independent monitor, approved by the DOT, with full access to all customer service algorithms, complaint resolutions, and promotion records for a period of 5 years. This monitor would have the power to veto policies and mandate changes. It was a request for a corporate trusteeship. The airline's legal team argued this was an unprecedented overreach, that it would cripple their operations. But the DOT panel had seen enough. They recessed to deliberate. The wait lasted 2 days. In that time, 3 major institutional investors announced they were divesting from the airline's parent company, citing unacceptable governance risks. The stock price fell another 5%. The financial cost of discrimination was now towering. The ruling, when it came, was historic. The DOT did not revoke the airline certificate. Instead, they conditionally renewed it under a stringent 15-point consent decree. The airline was fined $28 million, the largest such penalty in DOT history. They were mandated to create a $50 million restitution fund for identifiable victims of the protocol, past and present. They were required to install the independent monitor for 5 years, with powers exactly as Cynthia had outlined. And they were ordered to publicly disclose, every quarter, their complaint statistics broken down by race and cabin class. Transparency became a mandated condition of flight. For the individuals involved, the consequences were stark. Richard Pell's private equity firm forced him to resign. The civil racketeering suit against him proceeded, draining his resources and reputation. Gina, the flight attendant, after a period of suspension and retraining, chose not to return to flying. With a settlement from the restitution fund, she went back to school to become a diversity and inclusion trainer, specializing in the aviation industry. CEO Robert Sterling resigned to pursue other opportunities the week after the decree was announced. The board was overhauled, with Eleanor Vance assuming the role of interim chair. Cynthia Addisa returned to her engineering work, but with a new dimension to her career. She was appointed to the DOT's newly formed Aviation Consumer Protection Advisory Committee. Her first act was to propose a new federal rule. Any airline receiving a substantial discrimination complaint must conduct a root cause analysis akin to a safety investigation, with findings reported to the regulator. The rule is currently under review, but it has already changed how airlines internally handle complaints. The airline itself underwent a painful rebirth. Under the eye of the independent monitor, it rewrote its customer service manuals, eliminated discretionary policies that favored high-revenue passengers, and instituted a blind complaint review system. The first-class cabin was physically unchanged, but the invisible wall that had surrounded it was dismantled. Employee morale, after an initial period of turmoil, began to improve as toxic, unspoken pressures were lifted. But the most surprising detail emerged a year later. During a routine audit, the independent monitor discovered that the airline's old, discriminatory algorithm for routing customer complaints had been designed by an outside software firm. That same firm had sold nearly identical systems to 5 other major carriers. The monitor's report triggered a cascade of voluntary audits across the industry, as each airline rushed to investigate their own systems before the DOT came knocking. Cynthia's single flight had not just grounded one crew. It had sparked an industry-wide inspection of the hidden code that governed dignity at 35,000 feet. The story of Flight Fortwelve became a case study in business schools and law schools. It proved that discrimination could be measured not just in hurt feelings, but in stock prices, in turnover costs, in legal penalties, and in operational risk. Cynthia Addisa never sought to be a symbol. She sought a functional system, and in using the tools of her profession, analysis, root cause investigation, and structural redesign, she achieved what outrage alone never could. She engineered a fix. The sky, after all, is a place of physics and law, and both finally bent toward justice. The legacy of Flight Fortwelve is measured not in the fine but in the precedent. It proved that discrimination in the air is not a customer service issue. It is a systemic safety and governance failure. And like any critical system flaw, it demands a root cause analysis, not just an apology. The walls of a first-class cabin are physical, but the barriers placed around it were engineered by policy, by profit algorithms, and by silence. Cynthia Addisa's story forces an uncomfortable question. How many other invisible protocols exist in the places we work, travel, and live? Systems that mistake wealth for worth, that confuse privilege with priority. Her victory was not a personal revenge, but a professional recalibration. She used the engineer's most powerful tool, the insistence that if something is broken, you must trace the fault, expose the weak joint, and rebuild it to withstand the truth. The sky belongs to everyone. Ensuring that promise is not a matter of goodwill, but of rigorous design. It requires monitors, measurements, and the courage to question who the system was built for. Change, it turns out, doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in a calm voice at 35,000 feet, reminding everyone on board of a simple, revolutionary principle. You cannot build a machine that flies if you design it only for some. If you found this story of justice and structural change compelling, leave a like to support this channel. Subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden systems that shape our world. Because sometimes, the most powerful seat isn't in first class, it's at the drafting table where the future is drawn.